Well, there is a verse in Romans that I've never heard come up as a favorite life verse. You know, when you get together with people, it's beautiful. You share, what's your favorite life verse? And you hear the stories attached to that. But this is one I've never heard. Romans 5:3, but we rejoice in our sufferings, knowing that suffering produces endurance. Anybody's favorite life verse? Not yet, right? Rejoice in sufferings. We wonder, is that a joke? You know, we learned in Sesame Street, right? One of these things is not like the other. One of these things doesn't belong. How does joy and suffering fit together? Rejoice in suffering. So that mournful lament that I just sang, those lyrics are from Psalm 6 and Psalm 86, the two lament psalms just read to us by the Bartelts. They include these lines, "Have mercy on me, Lord, for I am faint. Heal me, Lord, for my bones are in agony. And my soul is in deep anguish. How long, Lord, how long? I am worn out from my groaning. All night long I flood my bed with weeping and drench my couch with tears. My eyes grow weak from sorrow. And then turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me because of your unfailing love. Be gracious to me, O Lord, for to you I cry all the day. Gladden the soul of your servant, for to you, O Lord, I lift up my soul. For you, O Lord, are good and forgiving, abounding in steadfast love to all who call upon you." Last week, we introduced the Psalms of angst and looked at Psalm 13 and particularly into Psalm 27 as Psalms of lament derived from scenarios of suffering. And if you didn't by chance hear last Sunday, I encourage you to find it online and give a listen to it because it introduces the prayers of lament that we're going deeper into today. Suffering didn't only come to people in Bible times, it comes to us today. We are not immune. We realize many of you are in the midst of suffering today. I think of suffering scenarios that I'm aware of just within my relational web of the last couple of weeks. Sorrows that I've heard about include such things as the death of a parent, someone's child going to ER with a suspected heart attack, a woman having a husband leave her for another woman just before he suddenly and unexpectedly died. Unrelenting long-term struggle with depression. Friends with two children who have embraced alternative lifestyles and rejected their faith and disowned their parents. Someone who's between chemotherapy and cancer surgery. Someone discouraged from past addictions that have returned. Strained relationships, don't know how to heal them or restore them. Grief from loss of jobs in a season of uncertainty. And any one of these could be overwhelming to us as they touch our lives or the lives of people that we know and love. We can struggle with what to do with our tears in times of trauma. I can remember a conversation with a woman many years ago who told me some severe news about some childhood abuse, and I asked her, "Have you been able to cry about it?" And she said, "If I allow myself to start crying, I don't think I'll ever be able to stop." I can remember a conversation with a middle-aged man at his dad's memorial service, and I asked him, "Did you cry over your dad's death?" And he said he hadn't cried since he was an 11-year-old boy. This is a man who I rarely saw reveal any emotion at all. He was completely steeled up. For many of us, a goal in life is to avoid suffering at all costs. We just want to run from sorrow or sadness whenever possible. Early in life, I heard this famous quote from A.W. Tozer, who said, "It is doubtful that God can use anyone greatly until he has wounded him deeply." So I made it my life's goal and plan to be the exception for that. I thought, God, I want you to use me greatly. I just don't want that suffering part. So I tried to think, what is it that caused people to suffer? Well, it's probably because they're disobedient. It's probably because they don't listen. And so I thought, okay, God, I'm going to be obedient. I'm going to listen because I want to be used by you. I just don't want to suffer. And some of you are wondering, so how's that been going for you, Craig? As it just doesn't work that way, right? So what if suffering isn't something unavoidable, but is actually inevitable? What if it isn't a bug that needs to be fixed, but actually a feature that God intends to use in our lives to make us more like Jesus? It's been said concerning distress, most everyone is either presently in distress, coming out of distress, or about to go into distress. So if you're feeling like, you know what, life is good, no distress, I can't remember any distress, watch out for what's coming next. You know, coming attractions, coming to a mirror near you soon is going to be some distress, likely. So what if God actually has purposes in mind for our suffering? What if He intends to bring suffering for our good and actually even as necessary for our holiness? So if God has good intentions for our suffering, wouldn't it be great if He showed us a pathway to know how to gain the intended benefit? What if God actually gave us a template for how to approach Him in suffering, particularly how to approach God in faith with our suffering, so that our suffering accomplishes what God intends it to accomplish and our suffering isn't wasted? Usually our prayer patterns as Christians when we gather is that we pray for suffering to stop, right? We have tourniquet prayers. God, make the bleeding stop. Make the hurting stop. And with good reason, because we love the people that we're interceding for, and we hate to see them hurting. But what if we learn new approaches to pray rather that God would meet us in our suffering, that God would be shaping us in our suffering, that God would bring us through our suffering to take us to a new place and to accomplish His desired purposes in us that maybe He can't accomplish any other way. So this is what we're going to find today in Psalm 31. And I encourage you to take out your Bible. I don't have notes on the screen today, so we're going to be in the text. And this is where we're going to re-engage lament. Last week, we learned how to pray in times of angst, times when we're suffering, times when life is disorienting to us, times when the problems in life simply overwhelm us. Lament points us forward. It provides us a way to move from suffering to hope. In fact, when we learn how to lament, I think that's when we truly learn how to pray. So here in the Psalms of Lament, we're going to see demonstrations, and we can learn models of approaching God in prayer, prayer that God hears and prayer that God answers. You might be in a season of desperation. You might be in an era of suffering. Let me say, don't give up. But also I want to say, don't try to self-solve. Don't try harder. And don't just think that things will naturally go away. And certainly don't try to pretend to generate good feelings, to cover it up. I want to show you a way this morning how to open yourself to God. I want to show you how to entrust yourself to Him according to the models in the Psalms, to recognize that through suffering, God is pursuing a deeper work in your soul that is part of Him growing your character. And in this difficult time, God purposes to grow you closer to Him. So we're going to see today what that looks like. So I want to ask you to call to your mind an area in your life where you are suffering right now. Give the Spirit space to bring something to your mind. Where in my life am I suffering? Or where is someone that I love suffering? Where are they suffering? And just in a moment, close your eyes, name that to the Lord. And dear Heavenly Father, as the Spirit of God is bringing suffering to mind, we are not pushing it away, we are calling it forth. God, we pray that you would be the healer. God, we pray that you would be present with each one in this room. God, we pray that you would turn your ear to us and meet with us, that we might find you to be our refuge, our fortress, the one in whom we trust, and that you might have your purposes and accomplish them in us. In Jesus' name, amen. So in Psalm 31 today, we're going to see this as a kind of template. And I want you to look first at verse 9 as it announces here the lament. It sets up the lament. Verse 9, "Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye is wasted from grief, my soul and my body also." For the moment, I just want to confirm this is the context for lament. It's when we're experiencing distress, usually to such a degree that it's affecting our whole person, our body and our soul. We're experiencing grief, and we know we are at the mercy of God to rescue us. So, in reviewing from last week, I showed from Psalm 13 how there are three aspects of lament. I am hurting, God is distant, and the enemies are winning. So we cry out to God in our lament, God, hear me, God, rescue me, God, punish them. And these are the central aspects of lament. But today I want to show you the framework for fuller lament, the bookends, what comes before the three cries and what comes after the three cries. So we see the full movement here. We're going to see today that before we lament, we actually commit to God. We take refuge in Him. And at the end of our lament, we're going to confess our trust in God. And then from this whole process, we're going to see that it moves us from distress to hope, ideally from suffering to praise. Can you imagine that? Having your heart moved from suffering into praise. So there's four movements today. In verses 1 to 8, this is how to take refuge in God. We take refuge in God by coming to Him. These are in your notes here. If you've got your notes out. Verses 9 to 13 is the second movement, how to lament. This is telling God your story. The third movement is verses 14 to 20, how to trust Him. We trust Him by engaging God in truth. And the last, which will be just really brief today, but how we help others. This is where we worship. This is where our testimonies come out and where we engage in ministry to other people based on how God has transformed us. So how do we take refuge in God? We come to Him. So, long last, let's read verses 1 to 8 here of Psalm 31. He says, "In you, O Lord, I do take refuge. Let me never be put to shame. In your righteousness, deliver me. Incline your ear to me. Rescue me speedily. Be a rock of refuge for me, a strong fortress to save me. For you are my rock and my fortress. And for your name's sake, you lead me and guide me and take me out of the net they have hidden for me. For you are my refuge. Into your hand I commit my spirit. You have redeemed me, O Lord, faithful God. I hate you who pay regard to worthless idols, but I trust in the Lord. I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love, because you have seen my affliction. You have known the distress of my soul, and you have not delivered me into the hand of the enemy. You have set my feet in a broad place." So, in Psalm 23, a couple weeks ago, we saw David image God as a shepherd who guides us. But here, we're going to see David presenting God as a mighty rock fortress in whom we have protection and shelter from the storm and from our enemies. We have a refuge to protect us. He's the one in whom we find our protection and our safety. And I want you to just picture this in your mind's eye so that when you hear the word refuge in terms of a fortress, what comes to your mind there? What are you picturing there? Consider the kind of fort that's set up at the top of a hill. For you Lord of the Rings fans, think of Gondor or Rohan, and you remember it's at the top of the hill, and there's this big castle walls that look impenetrable, and there's people up there with spears and with hot stuff, right? And your goal for safety is to get behind the protection of those walls where you are secure, where the enemy can't get to you. Because if you're out in the fields, you're just a sitting duck or a sitting deer. You're just out there exposed, right? So we see God here as a fortress, as a refuge of protection from the enemy. Whatever form the enemy takes, whether that's financial concerns, relational trauma, health concerns, or literal adversaries that are out there to persecute you, or to kill you, David is trusting in God's protection. So notice in verse 1, in you, O Lord, do I take refuge. God is not one of multiple options. He is the only one that David is going to. He says, I go to God and I go to you alone. He's asking God, verse 2, incline your ear to me. Listen to me. And I love this as a beautiful picture of God's condescension. Do any of you remember the children's storybook, Gulliver's Travels? Do you remember that? Just imagine this massive Gulliver who is condescending now to the Lilliputian people, bending down his ear all the way to the ground. And we get just a little bit of a picture of what it would be like for our God who fills the heavens to condescend down to us, to bend his ear down, to hear our concerns, to hear our complaints. Can you picture that? It's so beautiful what David is asking God to do because he knows that God does it. Verses 3 and 4, he sees God here not merely objectively as this rock and a fortress, but as being his personal rock. He is my fortress of safety. And God is not static. Notice he's actually leading and guiding him to this place of protection and getting him out of the enemy's traps. You can imagine, again, Lord of the Rings imagery might help you when they're on the way to protection. They're being chased. And God is guiding them. God is guiding us to where that fortress is. And we could get caught in the snare of the evil one who's set up ropes and traps to capture us. And God frees us from those. And then he guides us and directs us to his place of fortress where we find safety in him. So what I'm seeing here is that before God pours out his heart of lament to God, he has already established his view of God, that God is good, that God is trustworthy, that God is a place of safety where he can hide. God equals protection for him. God will safely guide him through his trauma. So before we go to God with our complaint, we need to be convinced of his goodness and his character. Let me ask, are you convinced of the goodness of God? Are you convinced that he is a safe place for you? This brings up a question for some. It's possible that for some of you, God is not a safe place. Or it's mixed. He feels kind of safe and he feels kind of fearful. In fact, you might be going through some trauma that you're thinking, I tend to kind of blame God for this. It seems like God maybe caused this. He certainly allowed it. I don't know how to trust him when I'm dealing with the consequences of something so damaging. So we may have this inner battle going on between the right answer that our mind wants to tell us and that gap between where our heart really is experientially. And when we're honest, we're like, I don't know if I can trust God. I don't know if he's safe. I don't know if I can trust him right now. And you might be here. And I don't have an easy way out. I do have 3 suggestions that might be helpful in pointing you forward. One thing is to call to mind the truest thing that you know and have experienced about God. So if bringing to mind your experience of God's goodness and trustworthiness, see if bringing those things to mind in other areas can allow you to trust God in this current experience that you're going through. You might remember, secondly, that there was a time when many of Jesus' broader disciples left him, and he turned to the 12 and he said, "So are you going to leave me as well?" And Peter spoke up for the group and he said, "Where else would we go? You alone have the words of eternal life." And that's good to remember, that even if we're not sure that God is a safe place, where else would we go? Because he has the words of eternal life. He is the one who has the power to heal. He is the one who offers abundant life now. And third, if you have trouble embracing God as your refuge because you're not quite sure that you can trust him, it might be a good idea to pursue a mentor or to find a spiritual director or a Christian counselor, someone that you can explore this with. Why is it that I'm fearful of God? Why is it that I don't trust God? And there's probably something very deep to explore, and it's going to take some time. That won't be one session, but it may be the most valuable thing that you do that enables you to come to God and to experience him as your refuge. Verse 5, look at this. This is a fascinating verse because it is one that Jesus quoted when on the cross. "Into your hand I commit my spirit." In fact, this was the final thing that he said right before he died. Now, when we look at Jesus' words on the cross, we find that he didn't merely quote certain words. In the words that he quoted, he's actually referencing the context, the whole passage, the whole paragraph, or perhaps the whole psalm that we're to be reminded of. And so we imagine Jesus to be saying as he's dying, "God, I'm giving up my human spirit and I'm giving my life to you before I die." In the old King James Version, Luke 23:46 quotes it this way, "And when Jesus had cried out with a loud voice, he said, 'Father, into thy hands I commend my spirit.' And having said thus, he gave up the ghost," is the old phrasing. And from this expression, we have the various cartoons that you've seen the cartoon characters die, and you see these ghost characters, going up into the heavens, so to speak, leaving their bodies when they die. Now, in a sense, Jesus was giving up his life, his spirit to God. But let's look in the original context here. Verse 3, he's saying, "You are my rock and my fortress." This is a statement of Jesus' trust. Verse 4, "You take me out of the net that they've hidden for me. You are my refuge." You are going to get me out of their snare, out of their evil plan. So when he says in verse 5, "Into your hand," he's saying, not into their hand, not into their snare. God, into your hand I am committing my spirit, my earthly life. And then he says, "You have redeemed me. You have rescued me, faithful God." I believe this is actually Jesus is actually expressing here his anticipation of resurrection in that statement. Jesus wasn't merely acquiescing to death. It wasn't just this nice, polite thing that he says, "To you I commend my spirit." This is him boldly expressing his full expectation that God's vindication would be coming soon. God wasn't going to rescue him from dying, but rather from death itself by raising him. So back to David and us. There's a little bit of some debate here about who is hating the idol worshipers in verse 6, but the point is the contrast. I trust in the Lord. I trust in the Lord's vindication. I trust that whatever I am going through now is not the last word. This is not the end of my story. It could appear that the enemies are winning. It could appear that I can't get through this. It could appear that there's a stronghold that is just tying me up and I can't break free. But this is a prayer of faith, of trust, that God, this is not the last word. I am trusting in you. There's another chapter to this story, and I am waiting for it. Because you have seen my affliction, and because you have known the distress of my soul. It said, verse 7, I jumped over this, I will rejoice and be glad in your steadfast love. There's that hesed again there, that loyal, enduring love of God toward His own. And then the climax. How do I know I can trust in your hesed love? It's because you have seen my affliction and you have known the distress of my soul. So David is able to envision God as his refuge, the one to come to, the one to entrust himself to, because he knows that we have a God who sees. He knows that we have a God who knows. God is able, it's not this blind trust. It's not this wishful thinking. I hope that God understands. I hope He gets it. I hope He's paying attention. See, we are the ones who only see partly. If we are having a relational conflict with someone, the thing we can be certain of is only that we have a perspective. I have a partial perspective. The other person I'm in conflict with, they have a partial perspective. We don't even fully understand the issue, probably, but it's God who sees the entirety of the issue. It's God who has the full perspective. God knows fully my heart more deeply than I know it. He knows the other person's heart more truly than they know it. And God is the one who then can be the refuge. God is the one who can bring us together. God is the one who can heal the hurt and the harm. He sees the entire picture, and He leads with His steadfast love. That's why I can come to Him. Researchers in the field of attachment theory have made a connection between how we attached as children to our primary care provider, usually mom, sometimes dad or someone else, with how we will attach to God. It's a fascinating relationship, and particularly where we will tend to run for security and protection in times of trauma. The question asked is, did a child have a loving mom or dad to regularly show up to console them and provide emotional attunement when they experienced fear or distress? If so, then the child most likely formed what we call a positive, secure emotional attachment. And we find that those who are securely attached to their primary caregiver are generally more eager and more able to be attached securely to God. That's the good news. But what if the cries went unaddressed? What if a baby is left in its crib alone for hours in the dark, crying, while the parents are in another room, not responding to the cry? Well, this causes enormous psychological damage to where the child learns that mom and dad are not reliable. I don't know if I can trust that when I have needs that they will come and meet my needs. These children tend to develop various insecure, anxious attachments. They learn rather to self-solve, to be alone and find their way. Find out sometimes when I cry out and call out to my parents, they come, but oftentimes they don't. So I can't rely on them. And we bring that into our relationship with God. We learn, I'm going to self-solve. I don't know if I can rely on God. I don't know if He's going to be there for me this time or not. So we learn to be self-sufficient. We learn to solve our own problems or try to. And we become distrusting toward any other spiritual authority who only inconsistently show up. And so we distrust God, and it makes it difficult to attach to God. I've recognized in my own life that I had some secure attachment and some insecure attachment. And I have patterns and two tendencies of the way that I come to God. One is to complain. In my conscious mind, I know that the fallen world affects everyone. Yet in my unconscious mind, I think it shouldn't touch me. I should be immune from that. So when bad things happen to me, I complain. I whine. I'm like, why am I experiencing this? So, when my eye thing happened that I've talked about a couple times, I'm like, God, are you serious? Why would this happen to me? I turned 58 recently. When I researched it, you realize that the spidering of your eye, these floaters, it happens to the average male at 57. I already got an extra year, but why should it happen to me? And when the blood vessel broke and it's bleeding and I couldn't see, I'm in fear of blindness. You know what? I didn't run to God first. I complained first. And second, I went to research. I went to Google. I started reading everything I could to try to understand what I was dealing with because I was fearful. And it was only after I had some diagnoses and talked to 5 doctors that really I began to pray and to trust in God. Why is that? Why don't I go to Him first? I'm hopeful that as I grow more in the Lord, that I can trust Him better, and that as I experience lament more and find God as faithful more often, that I'll run to Him sooner. And I hold out hope for myself in that. We take refuge in God by actually coming to Him. Now, let's look at the formal lament. This is where the desperate situation is brought to God. How do we respond to God when we're in distress, when we're suffering, when we're experiencing grief or any kind of angst? This is verses 9 to 13. This is the formal lament. He says, "Be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am in distress. My eye is wasted from grief." You see that? He's been crying so much, his eyes don't even work anymore. "My soul and my body also, for my life is spent with sorrow, and my years with sighing. My strength fails because of my iniquity, and my bones waste away. Because of my adversaries, I have become a reproach, especially to my neighbors, and an object of dread to my acquaintances. Those who see me in the streets flee from me. I have been forgotten like one who is dead. I have become like a broken vessel, for I hear the whispering of many, terror on every side as they scheme together against me, as they plot to take my life." Notice that David is telling his story. He's telling God what he's experiencing. And so that's what we do in our lament. Your lament is unique to you. You are expressing your hurt, your pain, your circumstances in full detail to God. You are announcing, "God, I am hurting. God, I don't see you fixing it yet. God, the enemies are winning and I don't know what to do. God, I need you, so I'm crying out to you." And we share the details of the story. So see David's honesty here and his self-awareness. I'm in distress. My eyes don't work anymore. It involves his soul and his body. It's a holistic, whole person grieving. In verse 10, he describes his sorrow, his sighing, his failing strength, his bones wasting away. Other translations use stronger words like anguish and depression and groaning. He seems to speak of diseased health and of people who oppose him. Sometimes we're feeling it from multiple streams of distress at the same time. Verse 11, his enemies are damaging his reputation. They're shunning him. They're treating him as an object of dread. Think of the living dead that you've come across, perhaps homeless people on the street who were once someone's baby that was held, right? They were once going to be the carrier of the family name. But through being sinned against, through sinning, the enemy has destroyed them in this life. And there they are, living on the street, everything they own surrounding them, barely staying alive, perhaps even living in their filth. We wonder, what has happened to this person? They become a person of dread. And that's how David describes himself, how they look at him, someone to overlook, or someone to despise as a reproach. Verse 12, it says, he's been forgotten like someone who is dead, or become like a broken vessel. This is often how the elderly feel. I used to be significant. I used to be valuable. They used to know my name and depend on me. I used to make contributions that mattered to people. But now, it's like I'm broken. I'm no longer useful. I'm no longer needed. No one cares what I accomplished in the past. Now I feel useless. And that's how David feels. In verse 13, he says, or people are scheming and plotting against me. Perhaps a bit like Caitlin Clark felt in the WNBA. What's going on here? But to David, true enemies are trying to take him out. So think about the story that you would tell God. What is your lament? What's the story of heartbreak in your life? What is not working out as you expected? The script that you didn't expect to be living? The sadness that you don't tell anybody. But maybe it's time to talk to God. Maybe it's time to talk to God more fully than you ever have before. To tell Him the whole story. I can remember my dad, after having lost his wife of 61 years, 3 years ago this month. The prior several years, including years of my mom's decline, had been some of the most endearing and precious times of their relationship together. My dad had studied lament. He had taught on lament. He'd given himself to it. For 2 years, he allowed himself to enter into crying, weeping, every day. Most every day for 2 years. Sometimes he would wail loudly. My sister would call me, he's doing it again. He's wailing, I don't know what to do. I said, it's going to be all right. He's just doing his Jewish wailing. He's a mourner. He's mourning. He's grieving. And that was part of his healing. There's still a lot of sadness a year later, but you know what? My dad's in a different place now. Over and over, he took his grief to the Lord, and he found God to be a refuge for his overwhelm. And he's found life again. He can breathe again on the other side of the trauma. 18 months ago, when it became apparent to me that my prior ministry was coming to an end, there wasn't going to be a future for me in this church that I'd been serving at that point for 18 years. It was a place that I loved, and I realized this is coming to an end, and we were going to have to make new plans. So I took 3 days off with Lisa, and we went away to grieve. We went into the mountains of Big Bear, and in springtime, things were thawing but had not come out yet of winter deadness. And I walked among the barrenness of the wilderness, and for 4 hours, I went on the longest prayer walk of my life, just pouring out every complaint, every concern, every fear, everything I was frustrated about, everything I was sad about, every worry that I had, every anxiety that I could articulate. Where does a 57, 58-year-old man get a job? Who wants to hire someone who's moving into a different area of ministry? I was troubled, I was concerned, I was confused, I was fearful, and eventually I poured it all out, and I was purged. There was the time came when I recognized, I think it's all out. I can't think of anything else to say. Things I've been bottling up for months, I think I've actually said everything. I think my complaint tank is empty. And the weirdest thing happened. I actually felt like the coolness of this breeze and the Spirit of the Lord resting on me. It was like it was going to be okay. And I had a moment where I recognized, I don't feel sad anymore. And I went to the edge of the lake that was partly frozen over still. And I looked around and I looked back at where I'd been walking for 4 hours and realized my eyes had been down. I'm looking at the deadness. That's all I'm seeing as I'm praying, as I'm expressing my lament to God. And now I finally looked out, and I looked out on the horizon. And you know what I could see? It was so beautiful. I took a photo of it. But I could see the sun breaking through the clouds. and I could see the snow on the mountaintops, and I could see the sun glistening off the water and the ice of the lake, and I could see in the distance new green beginning, the beginnings of springtime. And these words came into my heart, and I wrote them down on my diary. God, I feel like you're going to be bringing me out of a season of lament and into a season of new hope. And I had no idea that a year later, I would be applying for a position here at this place called New Hope. And God, you just have such a weird sense of humor. But God knew. God knew. He was preparing me to come somewhere else. And in lament, we tell God our story, and we don't hold back. We cry out to Him our complaint. We tell Him of our distress, all that's wrong, and we tell Him our fears. We say, I'm hurting. I don't see you. The enemies are winning. God, hear me. God, rescue me. God, take care of my enemies. Vindicate me, God, by your steadfast love. A friend of ours, psychologist and researcher, her name is Dr. Elizabeth Hall, speaking this past week in an event on lament, she says that processing our suffering both cognitively and emotionally is actually necessary for growth. She's a researcher, and they've discovered that growth is directly related to intentionally engaging our suffering. Meaning it doesn't just go away. Things don't just change. It involves us processing our suffering emotionally and cognitively. This is the lament, the no-holds-barred, God, this is how I'm feeling. You don't have to process it. It might not all come out right. It's raw. It's your emotions, and that's the necessary process because that's what opens the door, actually, for us to be able to receive truth. Then is when we can hear truth. Then is when we can receive and process truth, and both are necessary. So, we don't ignore our sorrow. We don't obsess in it. We take it all to God. We acknowledge we acknowledge that God's power introduces hope into the equation. And then we're reminded that God can act. And hope is essential for moving forward. If we don't hope, we won't move. We won't change. Hope is actually what reduces the depression. Hope is what moves us forward into healing. And speaking God's truth into our experiences can actually rewire our brain to create new pathways of new interpretations that alter false beliefs. We can believe false things for years that are hardened in to our brain, and then we have new experiences and we collate them. They just attach to our old prior experiences. This is why we sometimes misread people and we attribute false motives to new people and new scenarios. But there is hope that when truth is spoken into those dark places, God can actually rewire our brains and we can begin to take in new information. And God can actually change our story. So now the healing can begin. And it begins with trust. And we don't merely complain to God about how we're feeling. We do that, but then we additionally recommit our trust in God. We've expressed our emotions about what we're experiencing and how we feel, and now we need to focus on the truth. We trust God by engaging Him in truth, and that's what we see here in verses 14 to 20. This transition starting with this powerful little word, but, right? Verse 14, but I trust in you, O Lord. I say, you are my God. My times are in your hand. Rescue me from the hand of my enemies and from my persecutors. Make your face to shine on your servant. Isn't that beautiful? Make your face to shine on me, O God. Save me in your steadfast love. There's that hesed again. O Lord, let me not be put to shame, for I call upon you. Let the wicked be put to shame. Let them go silently to Sheol. Let the lying lips be mute, which speak insolently against the righteous in pride and contempt. Oh, how abundant is your goodness which you have stored up for those who fear you, and worked for those who take refuge in you, in the sight of the children of mankind. In the cover of your presence, you hide them from the plots of men. You store them in your shelter from the strife of tongues. I'm going to stop there. In these verses, we see how to make God our refuge. David is giving us like a how-to. This is how you do it. This is how you come to Him and make Him our refuge. We stop trusting anything or anyone else. We certainly stop trusting ourselves. We turn to God and say, I'm going to trust directly in you and in you alone. And this is where change begins. So we have this series of David's thoughts in different directions. It's David's words to God, and it's about himself, and then it's David's words to God about the wicked, then David's talking to God about the righteous, and then he's talking to God about God. So starting in verse 14 there, David talks to God about himself, and just scan through these first 3 verses. Notice he says, I trust in you. He says, you are my God, my times are in your hands. You are my rescuer. Verse 16, I need your face to shine on me. I need your steadfast love. Verse 17, don't let me be put to shame. I call upon you. See, David knows that for him to be moved through distress, to find hope on the other side of lament, that he needs God's countenance to shine on him. He needs to experience the love of God, the face of God, the smile of God on him. God's love isn't just a doctrine. It's not just a concept that's out there. It's not just an attribute of God. It's a known and experienced reality. God's love is His faithful, enduring, ongoing, never-ending, always available compassion to us. It's particularly so to us who are His children. He knows you, and He calls you by name. You are His child. You are His beloved. That's your identity. That's how He sees you. When you come to Him and put your trust in Him, that's who you're putting your trust in. Verse 17 and 18, David speaks to God of his enemies. He just says, let them be put to shame. Let them go to their graves. Let their lying lips be muted. Verses 19 and 20, David's speaking to God about the righteous. Here's a promise to others. Once we have experienced it, he can say, hey, all y'all, you in the congregation, you who are also part of His righteous, know of God's goodness. It is stored up and it is available to you. If you take refuge in Him, you'll experience Him as refuge as well. The one who experiences God as his refuge naturally becomes the evangelist to say, hey, you need to find God as a refuge also. In fact, we become those who can take others to the refuge and say, hey, that fortress, I know where it is. You can find it too. Let's go there together. God is available. He will hide you from the plots of men. It says He will store you away in His shelter from the slander of enemies. So to review this, we see that desperation is the setting in which our lament can take place. So we have this overwhelming distress that we experience. That's the opportunity to run to God as our refuge and then to cry out to God in our lament. So in lament, we pour out the experiences of our emotions to Him in the raw. God, this is what I'm feeling. This is what I'm experiencing. And then once that is all poured out, now I come to a place where I can think clearly. Now I'm at a place that I can hear and receive and respond to truth. And the truth is that I can trust God and I can see Him as a trustworthy one. And I can trust God to see even what I cannot yet see. So my hope isn't that things will merely work out, or that pain will just stop, or that bad stuff will run its course and finish. It's that I'm trusting God for the win. He's going to accomplish His purposes. He's going to do His work in me. And I know that because it's deeply rooted in His character. He's marked by His steadfast, faithful love, His hesed, His glorious mercy, His loyal faithfulness. That's who He is. So we cry out to Him. He's the one who sees and knows and hears and understands and acts and guides us. So we trust God by engaging Him in truth, and it leads to praise. Look at these last verses here, verse 20 and 21. Blessed be the Lord. See, now He's calling out in praise, for He has wondrously shown His steadfast love to me. This is His testimony. I was in a besieged city. I set in my alarm, I am cut off from your sight. But He heard the voice of my plea for mercy when I cried to you for help. So He's saying, blessed be the Lord. He's sharing His testimony. God, you heard, because that's who God is. God is the one who hears and answers. And then we help others through. And see, sometimes God answers to individuals, but usually God answers in the context of community. And so this is an opportunity for us who have experienced God as our refuge to come back to the church and to say we can become a community of those who are finding refuge together, those who are pointing others to the refuge of God, and those who are offering to one another the refuge we have found, so that we become God-like in becoming the people who also see and hear and respond and walk alongside those others. So we look at these last two verses. Love the Lord, all you His saints. Here's truth. The Lord preserves the faithful, but abundantly repays the one who acts in pride. Final words, be strong. Let your heart take courage. All you who wait for the Lord. Ends just like the last psalm did last week. So know this. It's not hearing about lament that changes us. I think James says something about that, right? We're not hearers only. We have to be participants in lament. For today's sermon to have any impact on your life, you can't just walk away and say, wow, I learned something about refuge today, and I learned some information about lament. This is a participation sport. You have to engage God yourself in this way. You have to personally run to Him. You have to express your heart in lament. You have to experience that He's the one that you can trust. God has given us 60 lament psalms here. We're just going through a few of them. I encourage you to be reading these. I'm reading through these right now. I'm praying through them. I've got number 70 coming up next. And as I'm praying these psalms, God is doing something extra rich in my heart. I want to ask the worship team to come up, and they're going to sing a last song. I want to just guide you for a moment in how you can begin to pray a psalm of lament. So as I go back to Psalm 6, which we had read earlier, where it says, O Lord, rebuke me not in your anger, nor discipline me in your wrath. I can come to God and say, God, don't be angry at me. God, remember that I'm your child. But I have some things to complain about, God. I want you to hear me. Don't punish me. Hear me. Listen to me. It says, be gracious to me, O Lord, for I am languishing. Heal me, O Lord, for my bones are troubled. So say, God, I need your grace. God, you know I'm hurting. You know I've been hurting for a while. And here's where I'm hurting. I'm hurting in this area of my life. And you tell him that area that you're hurting in. You ask for God's grace. You say, God, I need your healing. Even my body is feeling the repercussions of this. This is my soul and my body. My soul is greatly troubled. But you, O Lord, how long? Lord, I've been dealing with this for so long, I can't even count the days anymore. God, I'm weary of asking again and again. God, would you come through in power? God, I need you. God, I am not running anywhere else. I am running to you. Would you be my refuge? You just pray those words to Him. Turn, Lord, and deliver me. Save me for the sake of your steadfast love. God, God, you are the loving one. Your word tells us that this is central to your character. You are the Hesed God, the one with steadfast love. Would you turn to me and pour out your mercy on me because I need it, that I may be one that can one day tell your praise. God, I need you now. And that's how you can read through a few verses of Scripture and turn it to prayer. Put yourself into the story and pray your story to the Lord. That's how we lament. That's how we discover God to be our